I'm Justin Glaw, writer and journalist, and I've spent my career chronicling the violence, unrest, and chaos of American life. On this podcast, I'll discuss the events roiling this complex and troubling country and speak with some of the people trying to make sense of the madness that pervades our world. This is American Doom. Hey, everybody, welcome to the American Doom podcast. Today I'm speaking with Steven Monacelli, a writer and journalist in Texas who focuses on right-wing extremism there. Steven has been reporting on the American right for a while now and is something of an expert on the Christian nationalist wing of right-wing authoritarianism. From Mike Johnson in the House of Representatives to Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito to millions of Trump-worshiping Americans, Christian nationalism is an ever-present aspect of threats to democracy from the right. Today, Steven will help us wade through these troubling waters. Just for background, Steven and I met back in 2021 at a QAnon conference that I think, if I remember right, was called the For God and Country Roundup.
For God and Country Patriot Roundup. We can't forget that.
That's right. It was super patriotic and super bizarre. And it was a good, I think it was a good introduction to Steven's work because he concentrates a lot on right-wing extremism and Christian nationalism and basically all sorts of terrifying stuff there in Texas. And, one of the things I want to talk about a few things here, but, that QAnon thing, I was thinking about it last night as I was getting ready for this. And, QAnon is sort of faded, I feel like, but I think that what your work shows is that the backbone of it is still alive and well in the form of Christian nationalism and other right-wing extremism stuff that you cover. So kind of tell me a little bit give me a quick rundown of like what it is that you've been working on lately and how those two things tie together.
Sure. Great to see you again. That was quite an interesting experience for both of us and a good time to meet over a couple beers. And commiserate. So I think, you're right to say in many ways that QAnon has somewhat faded from the forefront into the background. And in the context of my work, what I would say is I found that a lot of the ideas that were really popular in the broader QAnon community have sort of suffused into broader culture in various conservative and right-wing movements, which is basically sort of my specialization in Texas. I focus a lot on sort of the far right or Christian nationalist type movements and organizations in Texas broadly, but also especially in my neck of the woods here in North Texas, where we have a large concentration of various sort of radical right groups of a bunch of different flavors. And in terms of things I've been working on recently that relate to that sort of starting point is one article I just had come out this morning in the Texas Observer. It is about a group called the Remnant Alliance, and
that sounds totally normal and not terrifying at all.
Yeah, it is a very normal name for a very normal coalition of groups, many of which are led by people who are members of this other group called the Council on National Policy, which, if you're unfamiliar with that, it is a group that since 1981 has sort of served as this secretive network group for far right mega donors and funders, and then the activists in the sort of broader conservative movement, particularly from a very right-wing evangelical Christian perspective, to sort of plan and then execute these long-term political strategies. And here in Texas, they're playing a big game around school board elections, which have for the past few years been a major flashpoint for not just politics in general and the sort of quote unquote culture war type stuff. Don't really necessarily like that term, but it at least is a shorthand I think most people will understand. And so now we're seeing this confluence of ideas where it's, sort of the Christian nationalist type stuff, related to, say, the Seven Mountains Dominionist idea and that sort of broader Christian meme, so to speak, that purports to, want to get Christians at the top of all the seven mountains of society, basically
Right,
interest areas and influence areas.
which is like media,
Government.
legal, education, government. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I mean, I think that the latest story is really good. I've had a chance to take a look at it. I mean, all your reporting is good. I went back in the archive and I read that 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 thing you were talking about, the seven mandates or whatever. I mean, that's an
Seven
insane
Mountains Mandate.
that's
Yeah.
an insane story in and of itself. And like, I think that what's important to note about this is, especially in the context of this latest story, which focuses on like these people trying to infiltrate school boards, is that since the pandemic, I think that there's been a lot of reporting on the school board stuff, and it's out of necessity, I think, has sort of had to have been dumbed down for people that are like, oh, this is about banning books, or this is about oppressing LGBTQ people, and making sure that there aren't like drag queen reading hours or something like that. But what's important about your work is that it shows that it is much bigger than some of those like snappy headline things that people tend to associate with right-wing takeover of school boards, right? To use like a super concise version of like what we're talking about here.
Right.
But the Seven Mountains thing is super interesting because of what it does is that speaks to like the broader implications of something as seemingly simple as getting a right-wing person onto a school board, which is that this is about Christian nationalism,
That's
right. I mean, that's pretty much where all of this begins and ends.
Well, and to start, to go back to where we started, if you go back and you read my article, which was published in Protean Magazine, which is this nonprofit independent literary magazine I helped start and am the publisher of. The article is called "The Convention Was Exorbitant and Depraved." It's convention spelled with a Q.
Mhm.
And I talk about how one of the speakers, I don't know if you were there to recall this or not, for this particular speech, I believe her name was Edme Chavanez, something along those lines. And she was using the same sort of language, that Seven Mountains Dominionist Christian nationalist type language, that we're now, seeing in school board elections, all the way up to Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House,
Right.
and his beliefs. So yes, I think that's right. There's this bigger background story that serves as the connective tissue for all of those snappier, not every single one, but I would say a large majority of those snappy headlines about schools removing books or having controversies over policies related to so-called gender fluidity. And a lot of that is also overlapped with big money funding from political action committees. And so there's this really parallel, and in some ways connected relationship and effort of explicitly political stuff with political money, which does the electoral stuff, and that's all legal, paired with this religious movement that is sort of setting the groundwork around what types of candidates we should be voting for, generally speaking, biblical worldview
Right.
holding candidates,
Right.
and defining what that means, and then kind of doing this handoff where these pastors and their congregations then sort of point to groups like Patriot Mobile, which, if you're not familiar with it, is just this. It's interesting. It's a cell phone company based in Grapevine, Texas, which is right next to where I grew up, and they're Christian nationalists. They have relationships with all these different sorts of organizations, several of which are featured in my recent article about the Remnant Alliance. And they have a political action committee. They've dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars in to support takeovers of school boards in the North Texas area broadly. And so if you read that story about the Remnant Alliance and you kind of click back through links to the series that it's a part of, you'll see that I've also done work around that political action committee side of things and how that interlinks with the Texas GOP and local GOP parties, so that you can understand that while there are local people involved in these efforts, it is sort of a part of this broader fabric that does, connect all the way up to some power players that, are within arm's reach of setting policy that could affect everyone's lives.
Right. I mean, how much does it even matter, like, if this is a chicken or the egg question about, like, these pastors have access to, like, these huge congregations, like, which is coming first? Is it that these pastors and these congregations are setting a Christian nationalist agenda, and therefore politicians are going, wow, look at this base of support that I could potentially have access to if I just glom on to this language and support these groups? Or is it that more of those politicians are like a Mike Johnson? I mean, he's a Christian nationalist, like, he believes in this stuff.
Right.
I guess it doesn't really matter for the purposes of knowing about it and potentially trying to stop it. But I mean,
Right.
how powerful is this sort of Christian nationalist through line in terms of getting power in the Republican Party and doing all the things that they would like to do?
Right. Great question. So I think, frankly, yeah, it doesn't necessarily matter. And viewing history as like a causal chain is a false and fallacious way of understanding history anyway. It's not that A leads to B, it's that there's these complex things that
Yeah.
are sort of operating in this systems level way of operating where it's hard to disentangle them. But I think
Yeah.
what we can say for certain is that, since around the 80s, right, there's been this like, explosion in evangelical movements, which, closer toward the late 90s, early 2000s has started to kind of change a bit, and that momentum has shifted to sort of a new set of what are known as a charismatic or quasi-Pentecostal churches, where they describe themselves as non-denominational. They're not affiliated with like a single denomination, but they're more like this independent network. And ideas like the Seven Mountains and other sorts of Christian nationalist type rhetoric has kind of expanded slowly in fits and starts. And now we're seeing it, like in the lead up to 2016, there was a lot of evangelical and charismatic Christian support for Trump. And a lot of that is solidified over the past, decade, basically,
Yeah.
where now, we do have true believer politicians who have run and have been elected, in part with the help of these congregations. But now we're seeing organizations like the Remnant Alliance, where they're using a strategy that the Council on National Policy has basically done before, where they seek out pastors that are already sort of primed to be like-minded. They're kind of already moving in this direction. Let's say, like someone like Kenneth Copeland, huge, rich pastor with a mega big congregation, and he was already sympathetic to Trump. So, everyone from him down to a more local church, what they can do is they go in, they build a relationship with these pastors, and they openly talk about how they aim to equip them with talking points, with, basically curriculums called biblical citizenship ministry, where they, kind of say, we'll do the work for you. We've got this package ready to go. And you can just kind of, you go to these trainings and then you can pick it up and run with it. And then you can start to funnel your congregants into these other trainings. And then, you become a salt and light ministry, which is one of the terms they use. And then you basically, quote unquote, set your congregation on fire, which means like activate them politically so that they can, go do kingdom activism and other things like that, which basically translates into political activism. And a lot of this is couched within the rhetoric of like spiritual warfare, which is a growing, an expanding sort of rhetoric within this independent network of Christian congregations. So, it's like framing political activism as like spiritual development or, sort of a spiritual war, and that spiritual revival can come from political activism.
And right now, I mean, at least I don't know, just off the top of my head, it seems like this spiritual warfare in the form of political activism seems like it's been at least mostly on the nonviolent side of getting people elected to school boards and like small stuff like that. But I mean, one of the lessons of QAnon, looking back on it, it's so interesting how long it's been since I've thought about QAnon. And I think it speaks to how much it's really faded in terms of like that it's being covered all the time. It's almost like it's just morphed into Christian nationalism and what we think of as that. But it's interesting like how quickly QAnon went from like this weird thing and understanding the belief systems that are in it to like, oh no, these people are straight up calling for violence against their political opponents and they are willing to commit it. And in some cases did commit it. And so it sort of brings me to, one of the things that I've found in reporting on election deniers here is that there's a huge election denier congregation of people that are like, oh, it's part of our religious, godly Christian duty to make sure that this doesn't happen again and that Trump stays in power, and have said like, well, and if that means some violence that has to happen to make that happen, then I'm okay with that because it's all part of God's plan. And so I'm just wondering, like, as you've been hearing a lot of this language and this rhetoric from pastors and politicians that you've been researching and writing about, like, I mean, is there a potential for like religious based political violence, for lack of a better term?
Interesting question. So I think the best place that I could point people towards is the work of Matthew Taylor, and I can't believe I'm blanking on the other person's name, but they did a great job in this podcast. I'm going to just pull it up real quick. It is about January 6th and the relationship between Christians that are part of this thing called the New Apostolic Reformation and their role in mobilizing people for January 6th. So he's got this book called The Violent Take It by Force. That's, I believe, coming out, in September of this year. And he is, kind of one of the experts in this sort of field of intersection of Christian nationalism and radical sort of right-wing politics. Okay, so it's Straight White American Jesus is the name of the podcast. Just had to make sure I look it up because it's a great name. And I quote Matthew in the article that came out today about the Remnant Alliance. And one thing he mentions is that this language of spiritual warfare, which if you think back to the QAnon convention and that woman that I mentioned and her rhetoric, that's been there for a little bit now.
But in QAnon, it was under the guise of like, we got to watch out for this pedophile cabal ring. And it was harder to grasp onto for like the average churchgoer, right?
Right. It was a little out there, but there was also discussion at the time already of how like certain Christian denominations were more likely to kind of in polling buy into certain core ideas that make up the broader sort of QAnon mindset.
Yes. Chief among them evangelicals.
Yeah, right. So I bet if you looked at the specific sort of like independent charismatic network, you would probably find maybe even higher percentage of them buy into some of those ideas. And so if you look at some of the organizations mentioned in my article, their websites, some of them have education stuff around like the Great Reset and other conspiratorial stuff around like global New World Order. And so what I would liken it to very much is the John Birch Society. And in fact, in the article, I mentioned that one of the people at this meeting of the Remnant Alliance I attended was a guy who refounded a John Birch Society chapter in North Texas. So if you don't know anything about the John Birch Society, I would say go look it up and understand how their whole shtick was like far right Christian conspiratorialism, where they said like Martin Luther King was a communist agitator and that sort of rhetoric. They thought Eisenhower was a communist, like all this sort of stuff, things that were very much fringe at the time. And so now we have Trump, and I think Alex Jones himself called Trump the John Birch Society president. So kind of we're now living in the world where that stuff has fully suffused into conservative culture, where it's just kind of like a part of the mainstream current. And I would say, a lot of the sort of conspiratorial stuff, maybe not the most unhinged stuff that would be at the QAnon conference, but like some of those core elements, say for example the Great Replacement theory,
Yes.
stuff like that, and how that came from far right circles and is now sort of just in the mainstream discourse. I would say like that's why we're hearing less about QAnon now, because it's no longer like a fully fringe thing. There are some people who are still like deep in it and are speaking in that language and
Yes.
seem further out there. But when you're talking about these organizations that are, they do believe that, quote unquote, educrats are trying to groom kids into the trans lifestyle.
Right.
There's this element of like conspiratorialism.
It's been mainstreamed. Like QAnon
Yeah, I
has
mean,
been
that's
mainstreamed into what these pastors are saying and what they're talking about, basically.
some of the core stuff. Yeah, there's certainly like echoes and strong resonances there and overlaps. But I will say, the most important thing about this is that, yeah, this is just like bread and butter Christian nationalism. When someone says
Right.
the word of God comes before the Constitution and they're trying to do political activism and, mobilize entire congregations to try and swing elections where the margin of victory is maybe like 1,000 votes. There are churches in Texas, in North Texas, that have like 10,000 congregants.
Right.
Or more.
One thing I was thinking of while you were talking here is like this concept of like Trump as a messiah figure. And I wonder if you've seen any of that stuff, because from my perspective as somebody who focuses on like election denialism and essentially trying to game out what's going to happen in November, which is like a pretty depressing and troubling thing to kind of think about all the time. But like, he obviously portrays himself as that. Other people portray him as that. And I'm wondering if like you're seeing that sort of like language and themes being brought up in these places, because that might help us potentially understand who the people are who are potentially going to cause some serious problems if he loses. So, and also it seems to just fit right in line with the whole Christian nationalism thing. Now they've got a real life living Messiah, right? They've got somebody who's been wronged, right?
So what I would say is more broadly, I've heard Trump talked a lot about as like a biblical figure or like
Right.
a prophetic figure, in
A
some
savior.
ways. Yeah, and I would say the most interesting comparison that I've heard made is when I was at Kenneth Copeland's Southwest Believers Convention, which is a big revival meeting in Fort Worth, Texas, led by Kenneth Copeland Ministries. Kenneth Copeland is the richest pastor in the United States, comes from the prosperity gospel tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Big deal televangelist. And I wrote 2 articles about my experience there. And I definitely heard about, some really interesting theories about their view on Trump. King Cyrus is who I've heard Trump compared to.
Which is he was like a bad dude, but he was doing God's work, so it was okay that he was doing evil things in the name of God, right?
Right. So I heard that is he's that sort of a justification for why he's this imperfect but also deeply holy or like biblical figure.
Right.
There's comparisons to Samson where it's like, oh, well, they're doing a witch hunt on him, but in the process he'll tear the whole thing down around him. If I'm fucking up my reference there, it's because I've had a long day, but I'm pretty sure that was the figure that I'm thinking of. And so, I've heard him being prayed for,
Yes.
viewed as, someone who's going to save the soul of the nation. So yeah, he, in many ways, he's become a very important figure in this religious context. He's been referred to as God's chaos candidate by this guy named Lance Wallnau, who is based in North Texas in Keller, and is the main proponent of that Seven Mountains mandate meme. So, this stuff, he was at Kenneth Copeland's big revival meeting that I was at in Fort Worth, and so were some other politicians. And how could I forget Mike Lindell? So, he was the opening speaker for this week-long event. And if you want to read more about that, check out the articles God's Army Gathers in Fort Worth and these Christians think God needs you rich and to rule the world. So that kind of gets to the core of how a lot of things have kind of bled together in this broader movement. And in Texas, we can see them kind of now mobilizing very strategically around elections that typically get, very small numbers of people to vote in them.
Like school boards and city councils and things like
That's
that.
right.
Right.
That's right. But also, state reps and
Sure.
others. And as I see it, and I think others do as well, it is sort of a reversal of the traditional coattails theory of local politics, where like national elections really drive local outcomes sometimes.
Right.
Now, I think what we're seeing is a very strategic campaign to go after hyper local positions to kind of squeeze some juice and then get people to respond to that victory and mobilize up the next level and the next level. And I think this is evidenced in, for a number of reasons, but in no small part, how like Lance Wallnau and others have been circulating this list of counties they view as very strategic, and several of them are in Texas. And we have seen a lot of activity around these. And, think about it this way: in Texas, the biggest county that Republicans control, even though they control the state, the governor's office, the legislature, all that stuff, they actually only control one big city. And it's not even that big of a city. It's Fort Worth in Tarrant County.
Yeah.
And if they were to lose Tarrant County, it would just kind of be a matter of numbers. It would quickly start to change the dynamic in Texas at the state level. And if you do that at the state level, then you change it at the national level. And if you change it at the national level, then suddenly very different possibilities emerge.
Right.
So, that's kind of how I see it now, is there are these very specific, well-coordinated efforts to go after specific counties. And this is a big part of it, this sort of rhetoric of Christian nationalism, good versus evil. And it's a mobilization strategy, one that gets at one of the last remaining sort of institutions of local community, not to get all Putnam about it, Bowling Alone and his thesis about the collapse of civil society in the United States. If you're in a small town and there's no Rotary Club, there's, the public library doesn't exist. The only institutions you really have are your public school and your churches. And the public schools are under attack now with the push for vouchers.
People who are trying to turn them into churches, essentially.
In a way, yeah. And if they can't succeed in doing that, they'll try and tear them down in the process.
So this
further justification for school vouchers.
This thing you're describing, where they're going. So I've heard some Democrat groups talk about it as the reverse coattails theory, right? Let's take national issues and apply them to like hyper local races so that we can get our voters to come out and make sure that we hold on. In this case, the group that I was talking to make sure that we hold on to seats on like an election board, to make sure that an election denier doesn't get on an election board because they probably shouldn't be there. So like that's being applied. Like this is the first I've heard of that sort of political gamesmanship idea being applied from like a far right Christian nationalist perspective. One last question, Steven, and I appreciate the time, you taking the time to talk to me today. I wonder if when I first started doing the election denier stuff, it was just all political. It was Trump got robbed. They screwed him over because he's a Republican and because he loves America and they hate America. And over the years, as I've continued piling up instances of election deniers serving on election boards, I've seen that rhetoric become more and more religious based. That it's along the lines of a lot of what we talked about here today, but essentially it's the basis of it is just Christian nationalism, which is that God wants Trump and evil forces are stopping him from having power to bring good into the world. Like that's pretty much it. And like the shift has been pretty drastic, right? Since 2020 to now in terms of the volume of that I've been seeing. And so like, I wonder if your reporting combined with that obviously very anecdotal piece of evidence, like is legacy media and just the public in general sort of like missing out on this? Forget a rightward political shift. This is like a religious sectarian shift almost. I
Mhm.
wonder if we've been missing out on that.
I think for a while, early on, it was something a lot of people were missing. I do think now larger institutions and more mainstream outlets are coming around to it.
Yeah.
Like at Rice University in Houston, great university in Texas, they recently had like a conference about Christian nationalism at the Baker Institute there, and they were discussing the current state of things and where it's coming from. I do think people are starting to come around to it, but I think where there's still blind spots or people haven't caught up enough yet is how it is in many ways like a product of a very long term effort
Yeah.
with sort of like very high level people involved. Certainly it's not to say that it's like astroturfing because there are clearly real local people involved, but it's something that has been a long time coming.
Hmm.
And I think definitely people who aren't in those communities or are not interacting with anybody who really believes in that sort of stuff, it kind of it's hard to believe sometimes, because we're all sort of now in our own little worlds. Instead of having a few channels we all watch or whatever, it's like the thousand splinters.
Yes.
Um, and those splinters are real, but like when it comes down to it, you only have one school board, no matter how many viewpoints and sort of perspectives there are. If certain people take over your school board, that's it.
Right.
There's no meaningful difference if you don't pay attention to it or not.
Right.
So I think like the impacts of it are now causing the media sort of at large to pay attention, which is in some ways I think a natural byproduct of the current state of journalism, right? It's like a lot of people aren't paying attention to something until the house is on fire, and they're like,
Right.
"Holy
And
shit,
yeah,
look at that!"
right. Look at this guy who just got elected to this school board who believes all these insane things from this very fragmented media world that he envelops himself in, that he's probably been posting about on Facebook for the last 6 years, but no, there were no reporters around anymore to vet that person before they just
Right.
got elected to the school board, right?
Yeah, I was the only journalist, as far as I'm aware. I didn't see anyone write anything else about Kenneth Copeland's convention. And that's a weird thing. I mean, I think it's an unfortunate thing, but if there are hundreds of people attending this conference that appeals to thousands of people, and they have like a television channel that reaches millions of people,
Yes.
that is significant,
Yes.
especially when it's starting to intersect with election denial. Like the first person they had come up and speak was Mike Lindell.
Mike Lindell. Yeah.
Fucking Mike
You would think
Lindell. I don't know if I
you
can say fuck on
it's
this,
fine.
but Mike
It's fine.
Lindell. And my jaw dropped, and I have the book on my shelf over here. I'm not going to go to get it, but the hologram cover, about how he used to be a crack addict and now he's a CEO and all this stuff. And yeah, he was doing the whole shtick. He was up there, and then they rolled it right into more political stuff. One of the groups I wrote about, I mentioned in the article, was at they had a person speak to the audience there. Talk about
Well, I mean, I think the reason that blind spot exists is it's similar to like the QAnon blind spot. It's like, and the election denial blind spot. Like I'm out here reporting on people who are on county election boards right now who are posting insane shit on Facebook, and I'm like, why am I the only reporter who's out here looking at these people? And I think it's like there's a blind spot because they're like, whatever, those are just a bunch of wackadoos. They're not going to be able to do anything about it. Like reporters think that, publications think that. They also think like this isn't news anymore. Election denialism is a platform plank of the Republican Party. So like it's inherently not news. And then, in your circumstance, there's probably a lot of people who are like, yeah, I get it. Far right, Christian nationalist, evangelical. Of course they believe all this stuff. Of course. But the problem is that like, those people now have access to like some of the most powerful people and influential, whether they're far right influencers or politicians or Trump or Mike Lindell or whoever, like these people are in their ear. And so it's like, it is important stuff to cover and to write about, and it can't be just dismissed. I think the way that a lot of times it does get dismissed. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Like we shouldn't wait until the thing that's so surprising or unsettling happens that all these outlets cover it, and then they're grappling with like, how did this happen? It's
Right.
well,
Let's
they've been
reverse engineer the belief systems and structures that were inherent and obvious that got these people to that place, right? That's kind of how it
that's
usually
right.
works.
That's right. And it's not like, some of this stuff like the Council on National Policy, they have a level of secrecy that they've tried to maintain for a long time, and we only know about their membership
Right.
list because it's like been leaked and stuff. But in
Right.
a lot of instances, like with the Remnant Alliance, for
It's all out
example,
there.
it's like it's not like I had to go undercover. Like I just showed up to a meeting and they let me hang out, and I
Right.
listened to what they were saying, and I was able to find listings for their other meetings on the internet that they had
And then you found in
promoted.
the other story that I read, the older story from a few months ago, you found like this obscure social media network where they're just like, that's a thing. These people are proud of what they do and they want credit for it too. And so it's
Mhm.
out there. It's all out there in some way, shape, or form. I mean, this isn't like old school 90s political investigative journalism stuff where like we had to find some like secret meeting of like Cook brother donors or some shit like that. These people
some
are
of that stuff is still happening, but like,
right.
yeah, in this instance it's like, no, like it should be easier for people to report on this. Like I don't want to say that it wasn't work to do it, and I did have to
Right.
go and find some stuff out and know where to look, but at the same time, like it's right. It's not like I had some guy meet me in a parking garage and like hand me over a manila folder of documents that they were risking their life to give me. It's like
Right.
these people are organizing out in the open to do what they want to do, and it is important because that's a part of how our democracy functions, and people should be aware of sort of what's happening and what the intentions are, particularly when we're talking about policies that some people might interpret as privileging one religious group over another, or discriminating against entire classes of people like queer people, trans people,
Yeah.
because of religious beliefs.
Right.
um, People who care about civil rights should be concerned about these things. We should also be careful not to like demonize every Christian person or every religious person just because there is a growing influential sect of people who are Christian nationalists. It's just that, we have to make distinctions and be clear about what we're talking about. You can look at India and talk about there's a difference between like a mainstream Hindu person and someone who is a Hindu nationalist
Right.
and supremacist even. One of the biggest right wing, like basically fascist parties in the world is in India,
Hmm.
and that's real. And they just use a different religion.
Right.
So we need to be careful about how we talk about it and not be too overly broad, but also call a spade and not be
But this is,
afraid.
it seems like this is growing. Like, and I know that Christianity and republicanism have always gone hand in hand, but like it seems like the Christian nationalist vein is like it's been growing. It used to be like we're godly people and therefore like maybe we don't like gay people so much. But now it's more like no, we need to take over every aspect of society and force our religious beliefs upon other people, right?
Yep. Or tear down public institutions in the process so that ultimately theirs are the ones that kind of remain. So I think, yeah, people need to take that seriously,
Yes.
and they need to understand that, yeah, it's not going away. Christianity as a whole may be in decline in terms of population numbers, but if you look closely at the numbers, at the breakdowns, what you'll see is that independent network Christianity is, this sort of larger grouping we've been talking about, is the fastest growing among
Right.
all different types of Christian sects. So it's
Right.
not like, the friendly Episcopalian priest up in New York that's like, helping house immigrants in their church because Greg
Yes, like
Abbott is sending up busloads.
that version of Christianity is fading, but this new like non-denominational Christian mega church thing with cool pastors that have like a band on the stage and everything like I, I mean, aren't a lot of those people just identifying as Christians and nationalists if they're not necessarily putting the two
Yeah.
together?
I mean, this is like the next evolution of what like Pat Robertson and other people were working on in the
Right.
80s and the 90s. You know, we're now in a new era, and there's sort of new currents or different currents that are kind of dominating the discourse in that sort of politicized form of Christianity. And it's where we're at. That's really it. I mean, it's an interesting formation to say the least, but it's not surprising because like where I grew up, mega churches were really the thing. Like I knew several
And
people
they
who
weren't mega
grew,
churches that were like, we're Methodist or we're Catholic or we're Episcopalian. Like those dogmatic differences between sects of Christianity are not really addressed in any of these places.
no. Oh, so that's one of the interesting things about these like non-denominational structure is there's no sort of body that, you know, like Methodists have been going through this whole struggle session basically where different factions within the denomination have been fighting over, you know, language around basically inclusivity
LGBTQ
for
stuff. Right,
yes,
right.
yeah,
Yes.
yes. So and like women, you know, there were fights about should women be priests in the past and other things
Yeah.
like that.
Right.
So these groups don't have that because there is no governing body to which they belong, or are sort of, you know, overseen by or would have to adhere to in order to have any sort of accreditation. So it's very much about like personalities and who, you know, finds themselves allied with others or who
I
finds
mean, it's
themselves
much more
having
capitalistic in
similar.
that sense, right?
That's right,
If you've got
entrepreneurial
a
in a
million,
sense.
if you've got a million YouTube followers, you've probably got more clout than the guy who's got a 500,000 in this world, right?
Right. Right. And that's why you'll see like interesting mixings of people, you know, and like another signification of the overlap with like QAnon type stuff is there's a what is it called? The no 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 no. Reawaken America tour. You
Oh
remember
yeah.
that?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So this is
Mike
Mike
Flynn.
Flynn, Sidney Powell, Mike Lindell, a bunch of other
Yeah.
B-listers that went around because after QAnon sort of began to fade, and really after Mike Lindell or Flynn, if you remember this from that conference, this was the infamous moment from that conference. Mike Flynn said about the coup in Myanmar, basically like, "Oh, I
Why
wish
shouldn't
we
it
could
happen?
why shouldn't it happen here?" Right. And he went viral for it. And that was partly because I posted the video and I think you posted it also. But then, anyway, after that, they started on this reawaken tour, which was basically a way for Mike Flynn and Lindell and these other people to stay on the road and keep making money and talking about what at that point was like sort of like pre election denial insurrection hype. Like, we're going to actually do it this time type thing.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So I mentioned how um, the Reawaken America tour is like a, you know, very much similar to Kenneth Copeland's prophetic news program called Flashpoint. It's very much like
Okay.
this blend of Christian, charismatic Christian conservatism with like a healthy dose of conspiracism, and
Perfect.
very much Christian nationalist in, you know, spirit and ideology. And so like, yeah, that is where we're at. That is a very strong current within the Republican Party. It's not the only one. There are certainly some Republicans who are not on board with that, but they're
Right.
finding themselves in this, you know, political bind or between a rock and a hard place when it comes to this faction that in Texas is like very much dominant. If anybody who's listening to this is familiar with Tim Dunn, you'll know what I'm talking about. And if you're not, just go Google him. He's this, you know, billionaire oilman who is one of the he's the single largest political funder in Texas when it comes to donating to politicians, to political action committees, all these sorts of things. He has his own church. He's a pastor. He's definitely like in that tradition of Christian nationalism. And you know, he's not going to go away anytime soon. He just cashed out. So he's got a ton of money.
Right.
Some people might say more money than God.
Okay. Okay. All right. This is for real. My last question this time, and then we're gonna wrap things up here. All right. Is it an Yes, it's an oversimplification. But can I put this as the headline to this podcast? Like, is the fastest growing denomination of Christianity this non-denominational, essentially Christian nationalist churches? Right.
I mean, yeah, I think there's some numbers to back that up, right? There's a good book called I'm pretty sure it's called Independent Network Christianity, or it's yeah, The Rise of Network Christianity, Independent Network Christianity, Inc. for short.
Perfect.
Independent network charismatic Christianity is really what the term is. And yeah, there's numbers to indicate that it's like the fastest growing. And then if you sort of look at that and how that relates to polling around belief in dominionism and other sort of planks of Christian nationalism, I don't think that that's a stretch to say.
Perfect and terrifying. All right, Steven, where can we find your work?
You can find me in a lot of places. I'm on Twitter, or I guess formerly known as Twitter. My handle is at Steve Vanzetti, STE Vanzetti, as in Sacco and Vanzetti, of American history. Then let's see, I write a lot for the Texas Observer, but if you go to my Twitter page, I have a link tree where you can find a link to a website that has all of my writing from all the different outlets I've written for. It's probably the best way to keep up with my work.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, man. We appreciate your work. Keep it up.
Hey, thanks for having me.
See ya. Thank you for listening to American Doom. This podcast is just a part of my work as a writer and journalist. To keep up, or at least to try to, because chaos and speed are the two primary drivers of my work, you can subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just search for American Doom there, and you'll find the investigations and stories that I cover. Coming up on my newsletter are more dives into election deniers working as local election officials across the country. This is work I've been doing mostly by myself for the last 4 years, and it's not possible without your support. American Doom is the only place that you'll find reporting on local election denier officials. So if you support this effort to protect against threats to democracy, please subscribe to my newsletter, American Doom, on Substack. Thank you.